Namaste. Today we're going to talk about Takaki, Strangers from a Different Shore, Chapter 8 and 9, Asian Indians and Filipino in America. Learning objectives. We're going to learn about the Filipino early history and we're going to learn about the Asian Indian early history. Chapter 8, The Tide of Turbans, Asian Indians in America. Now, in 1864, Hildebrand was brought to China first and then to the East Indies to look for possible Indian labor. Planters asked Hawaiians to repeal the restrictive labor laws. 20 years later, Asian Indians appeared in Washington lumber yards and California agriculture, specifically in the Central Valley and Riverside. So we have now actually a very large Asian Indian population in the United States. They were called the Dark Caucasians or the, quote, Hindu question. By 1920, 6,400 Asian Indians entered the U.S. How are they similar to Koreans? Well, in many ways, they're similar because they're all males, something like the Chinese, unlike the Japanese who are able to bring in picture brides. Now, of course, they had different phenotypes. They were light to dark, and they're racialized as Black and Asian. But what race were they, quote, really from? Well, if you're an anthropologist like myself, you could comment that they are, quote, Caucasoid or have Aryan a background, not how Hitler used it, but as in they are from the same area as the other Europeans. But of course, they went left to become the South Indians and Middle Easterners. The other one were right. Now, South Asians, unfortunately, were actually subjected to intense yellow peril. What was the yellow peril? Well, the yellow peril was this notion that all Asians were exotic, erotic, full of disease, and kind of like encased in amber, and they can never actually fully become modern. So they did come, so unfortunately, Asian Indians had a huge amount of racism towards them. Now, they did come from Aryan stock, but they were considered part of the new yellow peril. They're feared by Anglo workers and subjected to intense racism and violence. So much so that in 1907, several Anglo workers invaded Asian Indian residents in Bellingham, Washington, and drove 700 Indians across the border, according to Takaki, page 297. That is horrendous. Now, something about Asian Indians is that they actually went to court. Although Asian Indians and whites came from the same stock, one went west and the other one went east, how were they perceived differently? Well, there was this guy, his name was Bhagat Singh Trin, and in 1923, he actually sued and said he was white because, again, he is of Aryan stock, which is the same as Europeans. And unfortunately, and I usually ask the class, do you think of South Indians as white people? And usually my students will say no. Well, unfortunately, even though anthropologically they are of the same stock, the result of the Supreme Court battle was they lost. And they said that common man thoughts, although yes, anthropologically they are Aryan, they were not considered white. And actually this counts a lot of citizenships. So this was a very devastating court case. Now, they're very misunderstood Sikhs or Sikhs. They toiled all over Central Valley, Riverside, up and down California, Washington, and they had a huge impact in actually developing land. There are lots of notable Asian Indian books. The Karma of Brown Folks, 2000 by Vishay Prasad, and Everybody Does Kung Fu Fighting by Vishay Prasad. Excellent books. I highly recommend you read them. Now, unfortunately, they were subjected Indians to so much violence, and because of anti-miscegenation laws, they could not marry white women. So who did they marry? Well, instead, in the Central Valley, Indian men frequently married Mexican women. So in Central Valley, 76% were Mexican brides. So how surprising. Actually, over the years, I've had quite a few Indian-Mexican mixes that have taken my classes. And unfortunately, there's a documentary on this, but there were many cultural differences, and they kind of failed in these marriages, led to a lot of divorces. And also the families in India did not approve of them. Now, this completely was a different story for Filipinos. Now, Chapter 9 and Takaki, $1 a day, dime a dance, the forgotten Filipinos, Who were American nationals? Now, I asked that as a trick question because America took over the Philippines. And so they actually colonized Philippines. A lot of people don't know that. They took it over. And actually, so Filipinos for a time became American nationals. So actually, we have pockets of Filipinos or Pinoys all over the country. And in Hawaii, the Filipinos were regulated and there was lots of hostility towards them. A few, but not as much as the mainland, where there's massive Anglo hostility aimed at them. Now, they were definitely treated like strangers. They had labor pool issues. They were actually in domestic servants, fisheries, and in Northeast, they're in agriculture. Of course, in Central Valley, they did agriculture, and Los Angeles, they did service. So lots of different jobs all over the nation. And often the Filipinos were duped. For instance, they sometimes worked for a long time in the Alaskan fisheries, but weren't paid the same as all the other workers. Now, what differentiates Filipinos from other Asian workers is that they can understand and speak English. And so when they're being duped, such as when they're being duped in Central Valley or when they're duped in Alaska fisheries, they could fight back because they understood that they were being taken advantage of. Now, 60% of them worked in agriculture. 27,000 worked in 27 worked in agriculture, and they actually worked and they moved to different camps to actually work in the seasons. Life was much harder in the U.S. than it was in the Philippines, one interviewer remarks. Very tiring, heart back-breaking work for cutting asparagus and planting cauliflower. They actually arrived green, Takaki says, but they always fought for their rights. Now, something people don't know is Filipinos had organized labors in the Central Valley. And actually, in some cases, they had protests, and later on, they joined with Cesar Chavez. A lot of people don't remember that Filipino workers were also fighting even before Cesar Chavez for their labor rights. Unfortunately, they also receive services in many places, and they're treated as Asian or Black. Now, if you want to read more about Filipinos, there's great books called Positively No Filipinos Allowed, and also Filipinos in Stockton by the wonderful Dawn Babalon, and also Homeward Bound by Yan Espirito. So if you're interested in these great books, feel free to get them. So unfortunately, they're racialized as criminal. There's arrests. They had arrest rates less than Anglos, but they're stereotyped as violent and criminal. In 1930, there's race riots over mixing and white women. There, quote, people had a Filipino problem. People said that the Filipinos were stealing all the white women. Okay. So I will give you, and I want you to Google this after this talk. I want you to tell me what 1934 Tiley-McDuffie Act is. I'm not going to tell you the answer. I want you to find the answer yourself. Now, something I want to really encourage you to look into is America is in the Heart, A Personal History by Carlos Busalon. It's a memoir of his time in the fisheries and picking fruits in Riverside, California, and Orange and Central Valley. Now, Filipinos were only allowed in the red light district, similar to other places that only Asians or minorities were allowed to. Treated very poorly and very badly. So there are very few Pinay or Filipino women, and they're treated like queens. So unlike Chinese and Japanese men, many Filipinos dated and married who? Interesting enough, they dated and married white women. So again, I want you to answer, America is the what? All right, so learning outcome, you learned about Filipino early history, you learned about Asian Indian early history. Have a wonderful day.